For now, yeah, that's it from me. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Abel. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, perfect. Thanks a lot. And the announcement about the ANH Academy Week is very timely. In a couple of weeks, we'll hold another webinar about that and the organization going towards that event and the links to potential India ag-to-newt subgroup. So stay tuned for that. There's a lot going on right now with the ANH Academy, and so we're especially grateful that Abel and the others are taking the time to host this webinar. And this webinar was really inspired by a conversation with Tesfaye, who is leading this process in Ethiopia of developing the first food-based dietary guidelines in Ethiopia. So it's very timely because there's a lot going on right now in that process. And for many people, many of you who may have tuned in, it's not, you may see food pyramids and dietary recommendations that come from national level in the country that you're in, or maybe a country you've worked in. And this webinar is to give a little insight into the process of how do those come to be. There's a lot of steps that go into it, and a lot of work including understanding the food system, the agricultural system, and how that feeds into what the country may recommend that people consume for healthy diets, so that the recommendations are feasible and appropriate to the context of the specific country. And then on the other side, how do agricultural businesses and the ministries and the whole food system and agriculture sector potentially act based on food-based dietary guidelines? So I think food-based dietary guidelines are really an important target to be aware of as we talk about links between agriculture and nutrition, because one of those major links is improving the food system for people to eat healthy diets. And the food-based dietary guidelines are kind of a summary of what those healthy diets look like that's really tailored to a context. So before we hear about that process that's currently right now going on in Ethiopia, I'd like to start by giving an overview, which is also timely because this article that's listed here on the first slide, A Global Review of Food-Based Dietary Guidelines, has just come out a couple of weeks ago in Advances in Nutrition. So the link to the paper was sent in the email announcement and also the event page, so that you can find it and read in more detail. This was a lot of work to put together. Co-authors Mary Aramond, Christina Alvarez Sanchez, Jennifer Coates, Karen Christensen, and Ellen Muehlhoff. We worked on this for quite some time to be able to compare all of the current food-based dietary guidelines that exist, which right now they're for 90 countries, but there are more countries being added, which we'll hear more about in the second part of the webinar today. I also wanted to mention that the support for doing this review was in large part from FHI 360's intake project with a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we were happy to have that support to do this review. And it was really a great opportunity because only a couple years ago, the FAO launched this web portal on food-based dietary guidelines. You can go just search FAO and food-based dietary guidelines and you'll come to this page, which will provide you access to every existing food-based dietary guideline. So you can download it, you can look at the key messages, which are translated into English, you can look at the pictorial food guide, And this website that FAO launched just 2-3 years ago was really made it possible to do a review like this, because before this web portal, we would have had to go to every country individually and request the guidelines, and they may not have been in English, and it would have been just very difficult to try to review and compare guidelines across the world. And this web portal made it, I wouldn't say easy, but very doable, because we had all the information at our fingertips, as anyone does who goes to this site. So it's a great resource. The objective we had with this review is to provide a concise and descriptive global review of current food-based dietary guidelines. And fortunately, like I mentioned, there's more being added year by year. We also set out to assess the level and type of concordance and also differences across countries' existing guidance on key elements of a healthy diet. So where do countries say the same message all the time? And where do countries differ in what they're recommending as a healthy diet? And we also wanted to look to the global guidance from WHO and how that compares to what countries are advising in national food-based dietary guidelines. So to give an overview of the countries currently having food-based dietary guidelines, the majority are in Europe and in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then we have quite a number, 17 countries in Asia and the Pacific. North America, only 2 countries there, so it's 100%. The Near East, 4 countries, and then very few countries in Africa. So only 7 at the time of this review. And fortunately, several additional countries are in process right now, including Ethiopia. The year of publication of these guidelines ranges. It ranges from the earliest was 1986, and many were much more recent, just within the past few years, the most recent being 2017. So on average, the year of publication of across all these 90 guidelines was 2009, which matches that among guidelines that have had multiple versions, it's on average 10 years since the last revision. But many food-based dietary guidelines are in their first version. So many countries have only begun relatively recently to have national guidelines. And UN agencies have played quite a large role in supporting many countries to develop their own food-based dietary guidelines. In 42% of countries, they were in partnership with the UN agencies. So sometimes FAO, often FAO, sometimes WHO, and sometimes some of the other agencies. So as far as the results that we found, in a nutshell, the most common guidance that is articulated by 100% or close to 100% of countries includes consuming a variety of foods, consuming abundant fruits and vegetables, including in the diet starchy staples, legumes, and animal source foods, and limiting sugar, fat, and salt. And there's almost always in the countries that have food guides, an indication to consume some foods in higher proportion than others. So for example, here are two examples of food guides which show different proportions of different food groups. And you can see that in Jamaica, half the plate is indicated to be fruits and vegetables. So that would be the largest proportion of the recommended diet. And in China, the largest proportion is starchy staples. So we found that in 59% of countries, starchy staples were pictured as the largest food group, and in the other 41%, it was fruits and vegetables. So those are across countries the groups that kind of are recommended as the bulk of the diet in terms of calories or grams. So when we look to comparing national guidelines to global guidance, here this table shows some guidelines that are recommended by the World Health Organization in their Healthy Diets fact sheet, which was from 2015. And we can see that in the blue, most countries agree with many of these messages. Or I shouldn't say agree, I should just say that they have included them as key messages and focused on them. So 100% of countries recommend fruits and vegetables, 96% discuss including legumes in the diet, and 91 to 94% talk about limiting fat, sugar, and salt. And those are all consistent with the global guidance from WHO. The ones that are a little less common, about half of countries talked about exactly how much of fruits and vegetables should be included in the diet. So WHO recommends at least 400 grams, which is about 5 portions. About half of countries talked about a quantitative amount like that. And about half of countries mentioned whole grains, which are included in WHO guidance for a healthy diet. Far fewer countries talked about nuts as being part of a healthy diet, only 36%. 29% of countries talked about differences in fat quality, so differentiating between unsaturated fats or saturated fats, for example, or healthy fats or unhealthy fats. And then the WHO recommendation that salt should be iodized wasn't discussed in very many countries' guidelines. The topics that, so those were kind of the topics where there was a lot of harmony. The less harmonized topics, as I briefly mentioned already, were on nuts and seeds, healthy fats and oils, on meat, and including any discussion about substitutability between plant and animal sources of protein, and dairy. So to go through these briefly one by one, nuts were the least, they were the most often ignored food that we found, apart from insects. Insects were only included in one dietary guideline. Nuts were often just absent from discussion. And where they were present, sometimes they were portrayed as positive. For example, if they were portrayed in a protein foods group, and sometimes they were portrayed as foods to limit because of their fat content, if they were grouped with the fats and oils group. And sometimes it wasn't very clear whether they were a food recommended to consume more of or less of. Fats and oils also were one of the more confusing food groups across countries. So hopefully this review can be somewhat helpful in how people who are working on new guidelines may be thinking about the communication. So we found some guidelines that were pretty difficult to understand as far as, are fats and oils recommended to consume or recommended only to limit? Fewer than half of countries had a message on the quality of fats, apart from simply limiting consumption of fat. And in general, there's more of a trend in more recent guidelines to be differentiating between different fat quality. And very few of the countries included key messages on healthy fats. So of course, we have to include a quote from Greece about Greece using olive oil as the main added lipid. Was a good example of a key message on a healthy fat that was positive to include in the diet. And then here's an example from the UK, from their food guide, that did a nice presentation of this kind of difficulty in including and limiting. So showing that fats are included as part of the diet in the food guide, but then saying to choose unsaturated oils and use in small amounts. So kind of treading that double line of how to communicate about fat consumption. Meat was also something that was contrasting across countries with different situations. So for example, in Guatemala, where undernutrition was more of a motivating factor in the guidelines, it's one of the very few countries in the world that specifically say to eat meat, chicken, liver, or fish at least twice a week to avoid anemia and malnutrition, sort of implying that meat is not substitutable. Whereas many other countries, especially in Europe, we're talking about limiting meat. So for example, in Sweden, eat less red and processed meat, no more than 500 grams, only a small amount should be processed. So 23% of countries had a key message to limit or moderate meat consumption. And few countries address processed meat, even though there is a UN guideline that no quantities of processed meat are safe. So this is the Sweden's food guide, simply showing they were quite minimalist about their food guide, saying these are the foods to eat more of, these are foods to eat less of, and then foods to substitute. Half of countries that had protein messages included both animal and plant sources of protein, sort of like these quotes here, such as from Indonesia, eat high protein foods, animal or vegetable source. But there was regional variation in whether plant and animal source proteins were presented as substitutable. So it was most common to have this kind of message in Asia, Pacific, and North America, and it was not at all present in the Near East or Latin America, where both legumes and animal sources of protein were both considered essential to diets. Dairy then. Dairy was a tricky food group because it was very commonly conveyed as its own food group in 2/3 of countries. But that majority was really driven by Europe, which, as you remember, had the majority of food-based dietary guidelines in the world right now. There was a significant minority of countries that didn't include dairy as a separate food group, mostly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And this really matches with what we know or what we have estimated about dairy consumption in the world, where it's very high in North America and Europe and Australia, and low in other countries and regions where there's a lot of lactose intolerance. So it's important that food guides and key messages provided alternatives to fluid milk as well. So in conclusion, our review basically showed there is some quite simple guidance that's common to most or all food-based dietary guidelines in the world, including fruits and vegetables and starchy staples as the bulk of the diet, including legumes, including animal source foods, whether that be dairy, eggs, meat, fish. Some sort of animal source foods were indicated in almost all dietary guidelines in the world, limiting salt, sugar, and fat, and consuming a diversity of foods. And these are very aligned with WHO guidance, with the exception that global guidance currently doesn't have any statements about animal source foods. And future frontiers for developing new food-based dietary guidelines, we thought we noticed there were several guidelines starting to talk about sustainability. They're captured quite well in this recent publication from FAO. And there were also newer guidelines talking about rapid dietary transitions toward junk food or ultra-processed food consumption, focusing on some specific foods or products of concern in public health that had changed quite a bit from 10 to 20 years prior. And also, the minority of countries had servings or gram amounts in their key messages or food guides. So servings and gram amounts are actually quite useful in operationalizing food-based dietary guidelines by giving clear proportions and quantities that can be used for monitoring the cost of diets or the cost or the consumption of recommended diets. So it gives sort of a clearer target to see if people are meeting or able to afford the food-based dietary guidelines recommended. And regional guidelines also seem to have been helpful in some regions for the creation of national guidelines. So for example, the Nordic nutrition recommendations were echoed in many Nordic countries. And in Africa, it may be helpful to have harmonization across latitudes, which might have more in common than within country boundaries. Also, a lot of countries suffered from not having data on dietary intake that's very helpful to inform the process and to evaluate how diets are changing. And more countries are now developing their food-based dietary guidelines for the first time. So hopefully this review points to a few aspects that may be helpful to consider. And now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Tesfaye to tell us about the process right now happening in Ethiopia.
Yeah. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Abel and Anna, for organizing and also inviting me for this presentation. So my name is Tesfaye Hailu, and I work for Ethiopian Public Health Institute. And I'm also a PhD student in Wageningen in the Netherlands. So in the food-based dietary guideline development for Ethiopia, there are FAO is supporting us financially and also technically, Wageningen University and also CGIR through the Agriculture for Nutrition and Health. They are also supporting us. And these are also part of the team who are also working on the evidence and also on coordination. So when we see how the food-based dietary guideline development begins in Ethiopia, we have the national multi-sectoral national nutrition program, which is revised every 5 years. So the current program it's already started in 2016 and it will be end by next year. So on the current national nutrition program, the government already planned to have a food-based dietary guideline for Ethiopia, which is stated on the strategic objective 3 and also on the results 3.2, which says on healthy life and nutrition promotion. And also there are operational research priorities, which is mentioned also on this national nutrition program, the component on health and nutrition interaction component of the operational research proposed for the current national nutrition program. Also emphasis on the need of a food-based dietary guideline for Ethiopia. In addition to this, there is a program called Agriculture for Health, for Nutrition and Health, FORNH, through CGIR, and one of the implementing countries in Ethiopia. So when this project starts, one of the study going on was understanding or reviewing the food system component in Ethiopia, or the key gaps related to the overall food system in Ethiopia. So they try to see it in different aspects. One is the diet aspect. So what this review also tells us is there is a major gap in terms of diet quality, which is on diet diversity, also inadequate intake of certain micronutrients. Mainly vitamin A, zinc, and protein intake is low. But still there is also a knowledge gap in terms of dietary pattern in various settings of the country. From consumer point, there are also changing of purchasing power and also large heterogeneity of consumers are the key findings or the key investigations in this review. And as a knowledge gap, consumer behavior and also preference is not studied. And from the food environment point of view, fluctuating and increasing price of the most nutritious food groups in the country, and also the large difference between the urban and rural settings is also one of the key gaps. And the key knowledge gap is intervention effect of different food environment interventions are not investigated. So from the food supply system, the agricultural production in general, it's focusing mainly on staple crops and staple foods, but not now it's increasing also, giving an increased attention in terms of diversification of agricultural products. And there is also short or mainly short focus on mainly short value chains, except for cereals and also export crops. So in general, from the food system point of view, there are different challenges or factors are identified, like urbanization, population growth, economic change, agricultural growth, and education, infrastructure investment, and all these different components have also an effect on food system, and also the synergy and trade-off between those food system components are also is a key gap as a food system in the country. When we see particularly the diet, there is a very low dietary diversity and very little or no consumption of animal source food, and there is also very low intake of protein-rich source of food and inadequate intake of vitamin A and zinc, and also very low consumption of fruit and vegetable. And there is foodborne illness are preventable but not also precisely estimated. So there is possibility also having more foodborne illness. But how do diet change in time and space, and also regional heterogeneity of diet is not investigated very well. But this review in general, it gives also focus having, or the importance of having the food-based dietary guideline for the country. So these are some of the initial ideas why we start the development process. The other, the main key factors in Ethiopia, urbanization, yes, it's increasing. Urbanization expansion is one of the key factors. We expect to have a change in dietary habits. And there is also economic growth that's also fostering for different environmental change in the country. Like there are a lot of industries and a lot of food processing industries are also coming to the country. So definitely this will have a change on the future food environment or the future food supply of the country. And the population growth is also one factor. Ethiopia is quite big country and the second populous nation in Africa. So this will have also, as a factor, it will contribute for the diet change. And lifestyle change will also occur. There are a lot of highly promoted different kind of junk foods and also different sugar sweetened beverages and a lot of different advertisements also going on in the country. And climate change, which has also an impact on the overall food supply of the country. So why we need this food-based dietary guideline? The first is to inform consumers so that they will make the right decision or the right choice what to eat or what to not to eat from their healthy lifestyle point of view. That is the main objective. And in addition to that, food-based dietary guideline, it will also help to inform policy, for example, in terms of availing healthy foods that are included in the guideline, and also make sure it's accessible for the whole the country and also affordability of those healthy foods. This will has a policy impact. And plus to that, to set different standards for food, the guideline will be a good input for different standards to look at, to recheck the existing standards Also, if there is a lack of standard to develop different standard, the guideline will have a good input. And the guideline will also help to guide different industries who are now functioning and also coming to the country so that they will make sure they are producing healthy foods for the consumers. The other is it can be also used as training material for nutritionists, dietitian, or health professionals, or education professionals, or agricultural also extension workers. And also it will open research to do more research on food, on Ethiopian diets in general. There are a lot of diets researched done, for example, for Mediterranean diet, Western diet, or vegetarian diet. There are a lot of research going on, but when we see in general in Africa, there is a lack of research on diets, which kind of diet is healthy or which kind of diet is not risk for certain problems exist in the country. So this is also the same in Ethiopia. So this guideline will help also to open more research in this area. Plus to that, we are also planning to have a healthy eating index, which will be a tool that will allow us to evaluate once this guidelines develop and implement how much people are adhering to the message. So this tool will be very important. So there are 6 key elements according to FAO to be focused during the development of food-based dietary guideline. The first one is countries need a strong political commitment, and the second part is there should be a multi-sectoral working group. And the food-based dietary guideline, it has to be science-based or evidence-based, and it has to be also feasible and practical for the consumers so that they can apply the message to their daily food intake choice. And it has to be also compatible with the national food supply. It has to be culturally appropriate for the society, and it has to also promote behavioral change and also support for the policy system and environment in the country in general. So from this point of view, from a political commitment point of view, I already mentioned we are included in the National Nutrition Program, and the Ethiopian Public Health Institute is also committed to coordinate this project in the country. In addition, from multi-sectoral point of working group, there are around 22 organizations involved in this development process. So we established a national food-based dietary guideline technical committee composed of Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture, and also Ministry of Education from sectors. And there are also from academias like Agricultural Research Institutes and universities, different universities who have a nutrition program in the country, and also the International Food Policy Research. And from the professional society, Food and Nutrition Society of Ethiopia is also involved. And from development partner, Nutrition International, Alive and Thrive, Save the Children are also involved. And from UN, FAO, UNICEF, and WHO are also part of this working group. In addition, we also include religious representative from Christian, from Orthodox Christian, and also from Muslim in the country, and also from communication. The Ethiopian Broadcast Corporation representatives are also part of this multi-sectoral working group. So from the scientific or from evidence point of view, we also design a methodological framework for the food-based dietary guideline development. So it will have 3 phases. The first phase is developing technical recommendations for the food-based dietary guideline, which requires evidence, mostly the local evidence, is very important. Also, the global evidence exists related to the dietary guideline. So since we started, it's almost 1 year. So last year we had our first workshop with the committee members to inform the process and also to identify what kind of evidence is relevant for the technical recommendation development for the guideline. So based on that workshop, we identified those 5 key areas for the evidence, like priority disease and diet relationship in the country. What are the priority diet-related disease, and what kind of diet will have impact on it, and what kind of dietary gap exists in Ethiopia, the intake gap, and also food availability, accessibility, and seasonality. We are also trying to see that part, and consumer preference in the country, and what are the key determinant factors from consumer preference point of view, and what kind of behavioral change, nutrition behavioral change communication strategies exist in Ethiopia, and what are the effective part of this behavioral change, and what are the challenges. So we try to look at this so that this local evidence plus to the global evidence exists. It will help us to define the first phase. So we are almost now completing our first phase. This week we will have our meeting with a committee to define our technical recommendation for the food-based dietary guideline. So the second part is we have to translate this technical recommendation into daily food choice. So what it means when it comes to our day-to-day eating behavior. So how different population group has to eat or has to consume their daily meal. So this part, we will do it by using computer modeling or diet optimization. So for this, we need a different set of data on cost of or price, food price, or consumer behaviors, and also the food composition table. We need also that, and also consumption data and portion size. These are also needed data in terms of defining this. So we are now almost completing our first phase and transition to the second phase. And the third phase is mainly on evaluating the message and also the translated daily food choice from cultural acceptability or from the understanding of the message or from feasibility point of view, and also consolidating or compiling all those messages into one food-based dietary guideline, and also develop the food guide, which is the graphical representation of the guideline, which requires a lot of consultation, and also partly also there are studies we will also see in this process. So the fourth component is compatibility with the national, so the guideline has to be compatible. So for this one, we will try to, once we have defined our food-based dietary guideline, we will try to look at the national dietary gap assessment. We will do that to see what are the overall national food supply look like, and what is the demand based on the guideline. So for this, we are planning to use the FAO food balance sheet, and also there are different annual reports which is coming from the agriculture sector to estimate the food supply, the overall food supply in the country, and plus the demand. We will use what we define healthy diet for Ethiopia, and also the population estimates for 2020 in the country. So this evaluation, it will help us to understand what kind of policy or what kind of policy inputs the food-based dietary guideline development process can give in terms of production or in terms of food trade and industry policy in general in the country. The other part is cultural appropriateness. So for this part, yeah, the guideline has to be culturally appropriate. So for this, we are planning also to do some qualitative study to understand how this the message is appropriate for the different population group in the country, and also understanding and of the message with consumers and also with different people. So for this, we also identified to have a target group with high expert level nutrition, high level nutrition expert in the country. And also there are frontline community health extension workers and also agriculture extension workers, plus the community representative. Mainly we are planning to target women of reproductive age for this study. Then once we have the guideline, it has to be also translated to different behavioral change communication messages. There are existing behavioral change communication messages in the country for mainly focusing on 1,000 days, the first 1,000 days of life, which is from the pregnancy up to the 2 years of the infant and young children. But for the rest, there is a very limited behavioral change communication messages exist in the country. So this guideline will help us to have different behavioral change communication for different target groups, maybe for adolescents and also for school-age children and for adults and for different population groups. So for this, we are also working on designing different food designs or pictorial translation of the different food groups. So this is a kind of pilot we started by looking at the colors, what kind of colors can be represent different food groups, and what kind of shape can be representing the different food groups, and what kind of characters also people can give for different food groups, so that it will help us to understand or to frame our behavioral change communication material, or to translate it from the food-based dietary guideline. So these are the summary of my presentation. So these are the key steps we are following at the moment in the food-based dietary guideline. For the first phase, so we had a plan. So once we have a multi-sectoral working group, we have a plan, and we have also a sensitization workshop, and then we have a frequent meeting, and we also define our evidence demand for the guideline, and we did our review and secondary data analysis for to collect all the necessary evidence. So this week we will try to define our food-based dietary guideline objective, what will be the main objective of the guideline, and what are the technical recommendations that can be derived from the key gaps, from the evidence, and from the global evidence, and also from the local evidence. Then the second part will be mainly using data, price data, and also actual intake data, doing diet optimization, and also adjusting based on this diet optimization the recommendations we have in the first phase. And also testing the message is also important, and also adjusting and also translating those the guideline into different behavioral change communication message, and also implementing, at least we are planning also to have pilot implementation in different setting, urban and rural setting, and see how this implementation go, and also try to have a revision based on the implementation. So generally, so in Anna's presentation, she also mentioned only half of the country are revising and half the countries are not revising. So what we are planning is we will have also a regular revision once we have our first guideline. So this process will be a continuous process in regular basis, maybe in every 5 years or every 6, or depending on how the technical working group and the nutrition stakeholders in the country agreed on this agenda. So the goal is we will have our first food-based dietary guideline in Ethiopia by 2020. Why we want to be at 2020? Because we also revise our national nutrition program every 5 years. So aligning it with this national nutrition program will help us also in future to regularly revise the guideline. Thank you very much. Amasaganalu.
Thank you very much, Tesfaye, for the presentation. It's really clear how much information goes into the deliberations about how to capture a healthy diet in the best way, how to communicate. And there are a couple of questions about that, which we can start with a couple of the written questions. Also, Abel, is the raise hand function available? I think that, yes, it is available. So
yes, it is. They can raise their hands if they want to after using the audio function.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we see a couple of hands being raised. We'll get to in a moment, and some very first questions for Tesfaye. First of all, if you could tell us a little bit more about the meetings happening this week, exactly what's happening in the immediate term. And Larissa Loveman has asked, what makes someone qualified to help countries develop dietary guidelines? How does a nutrition expert get more involved in this work? So if you could tell us more about how the individuals from all of those organizations that you mentioned were actually selected or self-selected, or how were the committees and memberships formed?
Yeah, thank you very much. So the meeting this week will be mainly, the purpose is mainly defining the objective of the food-based dietary guidelines in Ethiopia. So what objectives we want to achieve by having a food-based dietary guideline. And we also finalized our evidence. For the past 1 year, we have been working on reviewing and also secondary data analysis of selected topics. So we will have a presentation on those evidence, and based on this evidence, we will try to identify what are those key gaps related to diets, like what are the diet-related issues in Ethiopia, and how can we prioritize those problems? Sometimes the problems might be more, and how can we really prioritize it? And what kind of possible technical recommendations can be given for those different diet-related problems? So this will be mainly basing ourselves on global evidence and also local evidence. So that is the main purpose of this week meeting with the technical working group. So hopefully by the end of this technical working group meeting, we are expecting to have at least a draft objective of the food-based dietary guideline and also the draft technical recommendations. So this will not be a final part, because there are many stakeholders and there are also platforms in the country. So we want to also share what we did, what is the draft, to the other stakeholders in the country, and get more feedback before we finalize this process. So that is the idea of this week meeting. How people are involved? Yes, actually, nutritionists, they are very important. They are very key in the development of food-based dietary guidelines. Also, other expertise is also demanding, because even though we need to define what has to be consumed by consumers, but we have to also understand the food environment in general in the country. So from that aspect, different multidisciplinary group is very important. So for that, how we identify is we know who has what kind of role in the country. So that we send our invitation to organizations like sectors, different sectors, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture, and Ministry of Education, and also academias and other sectors also who are involved in the multi-sectoral nutrition implementation in the country. So based on that invitation, they also nominate appropriate person for this work. So the committee meets in a regular basis. So plus to that, we also try to have a small working group who will mainly work on the reviewing of different evidence, because that's also a challenge, because most of our technical working group members, they have also a lot of responsibility and they are involved in different committees within the country. So mainly we try to use them to review what is draft on the draft review. So that is how we use them, and also now we call them so that they will see on the evidence, then they will make also a recommendation, technical recommendation for the guideline. I hope I addressed the two questions. Hello, Anna.
Okay, thanks, Tesfaye, for addressing the two questions. So now we're going to go to participants who have raised their hands. So I'm just going to see who they are, and then we will unmute them. So I can see Carol, so I'm just going to unmute you, and then you can ask your question. Carol Brown.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask this question. I'm a nutritionist in South Africa. I was involved in the development and the revision of the South African guidelines, and I've also helped as a consultant in other countries in Africa. In this regard, I would just like to make a comment with regards to your target populations for when you did the research, the understanding research on the consumers. You indicated that you would include women of childbearing age. I would like to suggest that you consider making that the person in the household who's has the main influence on the food that's purchased and prepared. Because if you have multi-generational households, it might not be the childbearing woman who's actually setting the rules as to what's eaten. So that's just a suggestion based on my prior experience. And then I would like to ask if you had any debate about whether to categorize fruit and vegetables in separate groups or together. In South Africa, we put them in one group because fruits are often much more expensive than vegetables. And if someone can't afford fruit, we'd rather they eat extra vegetables. So they need to be in one food group then. But there are a lot of people who are resistant to this. So I just wondered if you had discussed it in your country. And the second point with regard to that same food group is I've also tried in some places to motivate that those vegetables and fruits and leaves, as you have in some places, that are rich in beta-carotene should be in their own group. Because food-based dietary guidelines are supposed to be designed to address common nutritional problems. And if vitamin A deficiency is a common problem, you want to have all of those foods already highlighted on a food guide. And you tell people, when you go choosing your meal, make sure you have one of these. So I just wondered if you'd discussed that as a group, and if so, what your thoughts were. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Before you answer, Tesfaye, I just want to mention that we are at the hour and we're able to continue the Q&A. So for those who can stay, excuse me, we will continue for an extra 15-20 minutes or so to do the many of the great questions that have come in. And after this question, we have a couple more hands raised, Fatima, Sylvia, Maria, so we'll get to you as well. Thank you.
Yeah, Thank you for the questions. And for the food grouping, I think this is also part of the discussion for this week meeting we will have. For fruit and vegetables, at the moment we put it separately. That is how also we do the review. So it's a separate division at the moment, but how we have to use it in the guideline will be part of the coming discussions. So in terms of understanding the feasibility or cultural appropriateness, why we choose women of reproductive age is generally women are the one who are in charge of preparing the food for the family and also purchasing the foods in Ethiopian setting. So having a discussion, even though the economic or the income issue, who is empowered, is a question, still with the income they have, they are the one purchasing different foods for the family. So targeting them is an important, that's how we see it. But we can also discuss maybe and see which additional part of consumers we can include in our feasibility in future. Related to some of the vegetables, we also, by the way, we did also, there is also one review done on wild plants, edible plants in Ethiopia, which that review will also give us to understand what kind of nutritional value and importance they have, those not more consumed foods or wild plants in the country, so that we can also promote some of most nutritious wild fruits and vegetables to be consumed in the country. So that's also part of, that will be also part of the discussion. But thank you for giving us this input.
Thank you very much. Quickly, a couple of the questions that have come in on the chat box, I wanted to answer because they have something to do with the whole process of FBDG development. Stephen Mink has asked, how many countries have a formal review or updating process for their food-based dietary guidelines, similar to the USDA mandated technical committee that evaluates new research findings every 10 years? I wanted to answer by saying I wish that we knew. We don't have great information on the process in every country, and that made it impossible for us to include the process in the global review. And I was at a meeting organized by FAO and Wageningen University in the fall on the development of food-based dietary guidelines, and the participants there recommended that along with the guidelines themselves, countries are encouraged to produce a process document so that it would be more transparent to answer that question. So it's a very good question, and that's one reason we wanted to hear about the process in Ethiopia, because it's very interesting how this happens, and it's not necessarily the same in every country, although there are a lot of similarities as far as we know. And also, Elizabeth Zahner has asked, do countries also have food-based dietary guidelines for children under 2? So I wanted to clarify that the guidelines in general are for the healthy population over age 2. And some countries have guidance for subpopulations, such as very young children or adolescents or pregnant lactating women. But we did not review those, and those would be something that could be looked into country by country. I would like to give Fatima and Ramani, they both, oh, Ramani lowered her hand, but if you still want to speak, Ramani, you, great. I would like to turn the floor to both of you to ask your question or comment. So Fatima first, and I've unmuted both of you.
Thank you, Anna. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation of the research paper you have presented, and thank you, Tesfaye, for the work on Ethiopia. For the Ethiopia work, I have two questions. One on the proposed usages of the food-based dietary guidelines, and it was said on one of the slides that the food-based dietary guidelines would be used for food standards. I'd like to have some more information about that. And also there's a slide that discussed what would be used for assessing the food supply, and it referred to the FAO food balance sheets. But then for assessing the food demand, the food-based guidelines were mentioned again. I also would have some clarification on that. How is it foreseen to assess the food demand based on food-based dietary guidelines, where we are talking now about developing the food-based dietary guidelines, and there should be other means of assessing the food demand. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Shall I continue? Okay.
Let's hear Ramani's question, and then we can answer at the same time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Ramani.
Okay, thank you very much. It was two very interesting presentations. And mine is mainly for you. I think it was great you highlighted this, let's say, this difference in countries between meat recommendations and the nutrition considerations, environmental considerations. I was just wondering about the Benin message that you quoted. Because it seems to imply that meat, fish, and eggs is the preferred option if you can access or afford them, and there's no need for legumes. I just wanted your view on that.
All right, thank you. I guess Tesfaye, go ahead first, and we'll chime in on the second question.
Yeah, from the food standard point of view, yes, for example, certain issues related to diet can be promoted at this moment, but through time it can be also into the standard, and during revisions that can be changed. So that's how I also understood from the history of USA. So they have been promoting what type of diet, the fat type to eat, but after some time they also change. They also make it into their standard. So if there is a clear, defined, healthy diet within the country, it will help countries to align their standards towards healthy diets in terms of meeting, for example, the type of fatty acids within the fat intake, total fat intake, or other issues. So that will help the standard, whatever standard is come out towards protecting the people's health by promoting healthy diet. So that's what I mean. So it will have an impact or a good input. From the demand point of view, through this process, for example, when we have a food-based dietary guideline, that means we know what amount of food or what amount of food group has to be consumed on daily basis, in which population group, like how much amount of vegetables or fruits are needed for different age groups. So that will allow us to have estimation of what amount of food can be consumed by a person. or as a population. So with knowing of the population estimate and also knowing of defining clearly the type of food and the amount, we can clearly know what kind of demand is exist within a country. So that will help us to see how the supply and demand are really look like, or what kind of gap exists on which food group. Is there adequate fruit supply to promote a certain amount of fruit consumption on daily basis? So that kind of questions can be addressed if a country has a clear food-based dietary guideline.
Thank you. And then to Ramani, thank you for your question also. As far as the Benin message, which was basically to summarize, if there's no meat, fish, or eggs in a given day, you can substitute with legumes and beans, etc. I think that points to the importance of cultural awareness and context specificity of the messages themselves. Taken out of context, it may seem to imply that meat is the preferred option, as you said. I think that in the case of Benin, where many populations do not consume a lot of animal source foods, that message is crafted in a way that encourages people to consume them, but also says that if you cannot find or afford meat in a given day, that it's also a healthy diet to consume plant source proteins. You know, it's very tricky to design messages that hit all of the points you want in terms of cultural appropriateness, social and economic equity considerations, and also environmental sustainability. So as you're aware, Ramani, in that workshop in the fall about developing food-based dietary guidelines, it's a debate of how countries can recommend to consume animal source foods, particularly meat, in populations that may be at risk of undernutrition, but at the same time not encourage overconsumption of animal source foods, particularly meat, because of the implications on climate change and other environmental impacts. So how to design messages that encourage appropriate amounts of consumption is something I think a lot of countries grapple with, and in addition to equity considerations. So I think that the way the message was written has to do with trying to reach a population how they can satisfy protein requirements and other nutrient requirements. I also wanted to comment on another question that came in from Atul Upadhyay about that it's understandable that dairy products are a separate unit in European countries and other countries, but questioning isn't it because these are major dairy producing countries? Does that mean that food-based dietary guidelines are driven by industry and trade? So great question. Again, I wish we knew more about the process in all countries. I think that, you know, there are, of course, sometimes economic interests that come into play in the final dietary guidelines that are released. But my understanding, which is limited, but from what I know about, you know, the process that Tesfaye described and other lower income countries developing dietary guidelines, is that it may not be as common to be kind of politically, economically contaminated of a process as kind of jaded Americans assume, because I know in the US the process is so political. There's a scientific report which then gets translated through Congress and the political interests come into play. So it's not always so political. I think it's kind of an extreme example in the US, but again, it's a little hard to generalize since we don't have all the information. But on the dairy issue, several countries include dairy despite that their populations don't consume very much dairy. So Benin, again, is another good example where dairy is a food group, but it's really not often consumed. And when it is, it's not fluid milk. that came because Benin in particular and other countries have used linear models which indicate that it's important to consume dairy for calcium. However, your models, linear models for predicting what foods are necessary to meet nutrient needs are only as good as what you put in, right? So the evidence base for the importance of dairy for calcium really comes from the global north. And so if you use evidence from the global north in models to predict what foods you need, you might get diets that are skewed towards what's normal in the global north. So I think there's a lot of evidence to be built. There's a need for evidence regarding calcium, but even in general, how diet patterns in the global south relate to nutrient intake, because it may not be the same given the mix of foods that are commonly consumed. I hope that answers that question. I know now there have several hands been raised quite a while. I want to go to Maria Suarez Solana.
Sorry, Anna.
Yes.
I have flight, so I have to leave now. Maybe if there is a question, we can.
Great. Do you have time? I think Maria had some questions specific to Ethiopia. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, maybe one more question and then I will leave. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Sorry, now Maria, you are unmuted now. Thank you.
Hello, and I would like to answer to question. Why didn't the social organizations participate in the process of the food-based dietary guide? And the other question is if the guide includes recommendations for all the cultural diversity inside the country. And the last one is which has been the most polemical aspect in the Ethiopian food-based dietary guide development?
The last question, sorry, can you repeat the last question?
Sure. Which has been the most polemical aspect in the development of the guide? The one that has had more discussion if it should be included or not, or you should change the way it is written.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So thank you. Yeah, thank you. You finished, Maria?
No, I was going to put an example. For example, in Uruguay, the inclusion in the guide of the ultra-processed classification was like very polemical. And so I wanted to ask you if there's an aspect of the guide that has been really difficult to conciliate between all the actors that are participating in the guide development.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your questions. So I'm not specifically sure which of the social organizations you are mentioning, but I think, for example, we have professional associations, but still, you know, in the food-based dietary guideline, one of the challenges you have to also limit the number of members you have in the process so that it will be more manageable and handy to organize and coordinate different activities. But it doesn't mean we are only doing this work within those limited member of the work, the group member of the committee. This is just to initially draft different documents, but there are different platforms also within the country. We have different like nutrition coordination body or nutrition technical committees. There are different platforms exist within the country. So once we have all those draft documents, we will also present it and also share it for further discussion within the larger audience of nutrition stakeholders. So I hope this will also include different social organizations to be involved and also contribute more for the development. From a cultural aspect, you are right. I mean, Ethiopia is a very big country and a very diverse culture. So what we are planning now at this moment is designing national level dietary guideline, try to have at national level. But the assumption is different regions, we have different regional states. So all those regional states will also have a translated version of it. But in our diet modeling, we will also try to consider the most commonly consumed food for in different parts of the country, in the south or north or east west, so that this will also allow us to see different culturally consumed foods and aspects of the food-based dietary guidelines. At the moment, I don't think I could say more about the most discussing issues within the country. Since we are at the initial stage of drafting our technical recommendations, but mainly we are targeting now undernutrition, and also the emerging issue of overnutrition is also coming, especially in the urban setting, and also diet-related non-communicable diseases are also coming. So we have to see different aspects of the diet and how we can incorporate also forecast the future, the coming, because this guideline, once it is developed, it has to serve for a certain period of time. So during those times, there might be certain issues also happen, to see also what is happening and try to incorporate those aspects. But at this moment, we don't have really much discussion issues since we are at the first stage of drafting the technical recommendations. Thank you.
Tesfaye, thank you so very much for your presentation and the comprehensive answers and your participation to share what's happening on this webinar. I know right now Tesfaye is leaving to catch a flight to Ethiopia to actually continue this very process we are talking about. So thank you very much. I can stay on a few more minutes for a couple of the general global questions, but Tesfaye, we will wish you bon voyage, and thank you very much once again for sharing everything that's going on in your work to lead this important process.
Thank you very much.
So to go to a couple of the global questions, Sylvia Kaufman had a hand raised for a long time. I don't know, Sylvia, if you still want to speak, raise your hand again, and if it's a question globally, I will unmute you, so you are free to speak now.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I had lowered my hand because it was predominantly for Tesfaye, and the other two questions for Anne are answered already, but thank you for the excellent two presentations. They are full of information and full of facts, really great facts, a lot to learn from and well presented with regard to Tesfaye. And maybe Anne has also some background on it. When Tesfaye presented the drivers on the food supply system and food environment, he mentioned also value chains, and in particular the importance of short value chains. And I was wondering whether there are good examples where we add value, where we go into processing and add the monetary value, but also a nutritional value, and still be good to improve nutrition. Then on the climate change, and that's on Anne's presentation. You mentioned it now partly when responding to the answers. Climate change, sustainability, environmental footprint of foods becomes more and more important. also in view of urbanization and so on. I wonder whether there are some really good examples how to make sure to be climate smart, have a climate smart dietary guideline, smart agriculture and food production approach, incorporate climate smart diversification of food consumption as a quality criteria in such thematic reviews. And then on the common risk groups, I was wondering whether there are some good examples that are explicitly addressing issues on overweight and obesity, or let's say prevention of overweight and obesity. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much for that set of great questions. Just to say first that there have been a few questions very specific to Ethiopia, which I will compile and send to Tesfaye if he has time to answer, can follow up with that. And one that more than one person has asked in the chat box has been on the whether sustainability and climate issues are being considered in the Ethiopia guidelines. So we will see if we can get some information about that. More generally, with regard to the climate change and sort of environmental impacts issue in food-based dietary guidelines, the new Dutch dietary guidelines are actually a really excellent, comprehensive example of treatment of how food intake in the Netherlands is related to environmental impacts, with some very specific guidance in their long documents. And those are available on the FAO repository, at least the first links to the initial sources, and there are other papers around that have been published. There are several other guidelines that you know, in our review we did not include attention to sustainability because it wasn't necessarily in the key messages and would have involved digging into longer documents. However, that Plates, Pyramids, and Planets document does have a summary of several of the countries that have incorporated climate considerations into their guidelines. So I would recommend that document for anyone who's interested. As far as I have seen, but again, there could be more information that I haven't read in the detailed documents, most of the climate considerations are regarding what people consume and not production systems. I think that the dietary guidelines themselves are intended to be about consumption and individuals and how they can eat in a way that's healthy and sustainable, where those environmental considerations are incorporated. And then there's a larger dialogue to be had within the food and agriculture sectors about how to shift production systems so that they are more sustainable. I'm not sure that's a complete function of the guidelines, but it can at least, the guidelines can start and help to push forward that dialogue. As far as the question about short value chains and processing, there is some variation. This also ties into a question that Maria Suarez is asking about, since all of the guidelines recommend eating fruits and vegetables, are there some guidelines that recommend different ways of production? So like whether to consume organic apple or is that different than any other kind of apple, for example? There are some countries, and this is where I would refer you to the journal publication where there's more detail. So yes, all countries recommend eating fruits and vegetables. And then within that, there are several categories of aspects of consuming fruits and vegetables, which were not universal. But for example, many countries had mentioned something about local production or about fresh consumption or about just maybe diverse sources of fruits and vegetables. So you can look at some of the key messages we put in the paper about those questions. It was more variable country by country. Some countries noted that fruits and vegetables in any form are good to consume, whether they may be in a somewhat processed form, such as frozen or canned. Some documents specifically recommended fresh. So there was some variation there in terms of the emphasis. I think that, Sylvia, was there another part of the question?
Yeah, no, the obesity examples.
Yes, thank you. I knew I was missing something. Yes, so that's also an issue where many of the newer guidelines have incorporated more about obesity and diet-related non-communicable disease prevention. Of course, it really matches with what's happening in countries with regard to dietary and nutrition transitions. And also many European countries deal with recommendations that have to do with NCD prevention. So one good example from a newer guideline is the Uruguay guide, which is quite new, which very specifically deals with trying to reduce ultra-processed food consumption and has a lot to do with changing dietary patterns and obesity and NCDs. But there are several newer guidelines that are dealing with those issues even in lower income countries.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have all the hands raised have been able to speak. And we have one announcement from Fatima. I don't know if she's still online or if she had to go. Yes, Fatima, if you would like to speak and give the announcement, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. It's just a clarification on the question that was asked about food-based dietary guidelines for children or toddlers below the age of 2. Some countries are working on them. At the moment, FAO is assisting Colombia in one of these food-based dietary guidelines. So this is just a clarification. And then the second thing that I wanted to share with all of you is that FAO is launching a series of webinars, 6 of them in 2019, on food-based guidelines. And these are meant to accompany the work that we are doing to update the methodology for developing food-based dietary guidelines and for integrating sustainability in the development process. So the first webinar is entitled Unpacking Food-Based Dietary Guidelines, and it will take place in June, on the 4th of June, at 13 hours GMT, and will center on the following questions. What are national food-based dietary guidelines? How have they been used traditionally? And what is their potential? So, yes. So, and then the webinar will also address common misconceptions about food-based dietary guidelines, because we get a lot of confused messages about them, and some examples of national food-based dietary guidelines across the world and the current FAO work, including what we are doing in terms of a resource kit on the implementation of food-based dietary guidelines.
Thank you very much. We will be sure to send that announcement also within the follow-up to this webinar so that people can join those that series of webinars if they're further interested. That's wonderful. And FAO has been doing so much to assist countries and also make improve access to this information globally. So it's a wonderful service that FAO is doing, and it'll be very interesting to hear about some of those aspects in the upcoming webinar series. So we'll certainly include that in the follow-up, as well as the webinar recording here, which will be available, and in addition to the resources which are listed on the event page at ANH Academy for this webinar. So in a follow-up email, I'll include all of those links, and if possible, some answers to the questions that we weren't able to get to. But thank you everyone for your participation today, and for those who stayed the extra time for Q&A. Really appreciate the interest and the great questions. And thank you also to Abel and ANH Academy for hosting, and looking forward to the next webinar where we will talk more about the ANH Academy Week that's coming up. So thanks all once again, and we will follow up with those links and information about this topic.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.